A classic question that often occurs to fans of 1984 is if Julia, fellow rebel and lover of Winston Smith, was in fact a spy. Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we consider the pros and cons of this theory. So why do some people believe Julia is a spy? Well, Winston himself was not averse to the possibility earlier on in the novel. He often considered that Julia could very well be an independent sneak. That is, an enthusiastic and bigoted party member who eagerly sought out thought criminals of her own volition. True, Winston did not seriously think she could be a full-blown member of the thought police itself, thinking this unlikely, but that her frequent glances at him and inordinate proximity to him at times was worrying enough. Winston mused that Julia was just the sort to denounce him, her sort being the young women who were often the most bigoted members of the party, the swallowers of slogans and nosers out of unorthodoxy, as Winston put it. The first solid reason we might have to doubt her is just who she is and the potential of that as a source of arrests for the thought police. While Winston may broadly be correct in thinking she is not a full member of the thought police, Julia could still very well be associated with them and loosely work for them. Indeed, many spies in our history were young, attractive women. These women found it easy to seduce and entrap enemy men and were highly valued sources of intelligence for their handlers. Undoubtedly, Julia at least could very feasibly have been a spy, given she was attractive. Even the party leaders acknowledged that the male sex instinct is less controllable than women's. We know this from Julia's explanation as to how pornosec is staffed. The department is almost exclusively staffed with young girls, whose sexual instincts are said to be more controllable. The theory further goes that they are less likely to be corrupted by the filth produced there for the proletariat. The party even frowns upon married women working there, with only the head of the department not being a young and pure girl. The point here is that the party are perfectly aware that, even in their oppressive society, men can be tempted by or manipulated through sex. It is a sure path to sex crime and thought crime, and so a good way to root out such heretics. A second reason to suspect Julia is in her attraction to Winston to begin with. Though it may be controversial to say, looks are at least the initial overriding factor in initiating sexual relationships. Winston is 13 years older than Julia and clearly considers himself unattractive in a conventional sense. Quote, "Now that you've seen what I'm really like, can you still bear to look at me?" "Yes, easily. I'm 39 years old. I've got a wife that I can't get rid of. I've got varicose veins. I've got 5 false teeth. I couldn't care less," said the girl. Of course, many may cite the old adage that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and this may very well be the case with Julia and Winston. Winston may simply be attractive to her in his manner and attitude. Indeed, she later says there was something about him that she knew he was against them, that is, the party. She did witness Winston emerging from Charrington's shop, humming an old tune. Such an act in itself was unusual, and in the world of 1984, brave. It's not difficult, therefore, to imagine that Julia was attracted to Winston, given his apparent, almost brazen opposition to the party. To be mysterious and brave holds an attraction in and of itself for some. Another pertinent point is on the availability of partners in this world. Unlike in our world, Julia couldn't simply log into Tinder or Bumble and right swipe on a nice man she liked. Any relationships, even those between parent and child, let alone lovers, are highly dangerous, with the risk of denunciation being high. Julia does later frame her contact with Winston as taking a chance, implying that she knows such contact could go very wrong. Given partner options are obviously very restricted, is Julia's interest in pursuit of Winston really that unrealistic? Wheeling back for a few moments, there is also the matter of the catalyst of the relationship to begin with. Isn't Julia's note with the words "I love you" written on it, on closer consideration, a bit odd and a red flag? Love is a strong word to apply to a man you've never properly met. Shouldn't Winston have had alarm bells ringing in his head at this? Incidentally, the manner in which the note was smuggled to Winston is also suspect. Though Julia staged a fall to enable Winston to physically contact her to receive the note, this was still incredibly risky, perhaps too risky to not be incredible. All of this took place in full view of a telescreen. We know how perceptive watchers are. One famous example is that of the instructress during Winston's morning exercise, who instantly picked up on his lackluster effort in touching his toes. The watchers in the Ministry of Love were similarly hypervigilant, screaming at Winston for covering his face or putting his hands in his pockets. Winston furthermore instinctively knows people will be watching the telescreens placed in the toilets too. Both Winston and Julia know the dangers of telescreens. Winston initially rejects Julia's later suggestion that they meet in Victory Square because of them. Given this, Julia's choice of location for first contact is highly suspect. The scene also takes place very close to the eventual initial meeting place of Winston and O'Brien, in which O'Brien writes clearly and unabashedly in front of the telescreen his address for Winston. Was the link of location between the two scenes a subtle nod by Orwell of Julia's true identity too? O'Brien, after all, did prove to be a spy. Pushing back on these points, firstly we have to consider the context of the situation too. Julia could not know Winston's location or particular movements at any given time, and so the location may very well have been the best chance of contact. The passing of a note in the canteen may have been riskier with both telescreens and other prying eyes there. Approaching Winston in any other way would be highly suspect, and leaving the note with him in some other way loses the connection with her. On reflection, the scene of the note giving was probably a matter of luck, an arbitrary decision. Julia perhaps likely planned for some time to get Winston alone. She was often noted to be close to him at times, such as at the 2 minutes hate. She also followed him to Charrington's too. For all we know, this staged fall was the latest and at last successful attempt at contact. Julia later says to Winston that she's likely better at finding things out than he is. Perhaps she had some information on his movements and planned the fall to coincide with his break, or at a point she knew he would be walking down the corridor. On the risk of the telescreen, this may simply have been an unavoidable hazard and drawback of the location. Telescreens and microphones are everywhere anyway, so perhaps Julia's choice of location was merely the best of a bad bunch of scenarios she had considered. In the event too, she evidently thought the risk was worth it to initiate contact. On the content of the note, on initial consideration the words may seem extreme, but when I think about it more, they also make sense given the context of the situation. Any written note is highly dangerous if found. Handwriting may give the writer away easily, and so a very short note makes sense. In this spirit, it further makes sense the shorter the message, the better. However, it must also be clear to avoid taking further risk with another note or contact attempt. The idea, too, is to set up trust. After the note, both Winston and Julia trust each other and can surreptitiously communicate, so it was also a one-time risk of potentially incriminating her. Something like, "Meet me at X," or something like that, invites doubt from Winston. He may be frightened off. Meet for what, he may have thought. "I love you" is direct and unambiguous, leaving Winston no room for doubt as to Julia's intentions. Indeed, Winston even frames her actions as advances after receiving it, showing the words had the desired effect. "I love you," then, is not particularly a red flag of Julia's double agent status, in my opinion. Putting our conspiratorial hats back on, at the meeting in the clearing, there are other possible indications of Julia's spy status. We have touched upon a couple already. Firstly, Julia says she's good at spotting people who don't belong, saying it was something about Winston's look that gave him away. We must assume that Winston's expression is not so indicative of his thought crime as to be obvious, as otherwise he would have been denounced long ago by any random party comrade, let alone comrades like Syme, or Parsons who knew him well. Given this, it logically follows that Julia is particularly skilled at spotting heretical faces, and this is obviously a skill shared by members of the Fort Police. In addition, she also admits in the same meeting that she is good at finding out things about people, which is literally the whole point of a spy, to gather intelligence on people. To be fair, her exact wording is she's better than Winston at finding things out, like his name. Being better than him does not necessarily translate to her being the oceanic equivalent of Mata Hari. For those fully buying into the spy theory, the fact that she was also a troop leader in the spies themselves is also significant. For me though, this fact alone is not that convincing. Many kids are routinely inducted into the spies, and a wider culture exists of denunciation anyway. Troop leader does distinguish her somewhat, but is not that spectacular. In addition, Julia does explain that participation in such groups, at least after the age of 16 if not before, was largely for what she called her camouflage. Julia explains to Winston later that participation in the Junior Anti-Sex League after-work activities, lectures and community stuff etc. were all good for covering up her affairs. Given we know Julia clothes herself in good deeds in her adult life, this does somewhat dull the glint of her childhood in the spies somewhat. We know from what she tells Winston that she has been a sex criminal since the age of 16, having had an affair with a party member aged 60. We simply don't know how far back Julia's own thought crime goes, and her philosophy on eager participation in groups to cover it up. Another red flag for some is the amount of successful encounters Julia has had. At meeting Winston, she was 26. Having begun her sex crimes at 16, that's an impressive decade's worth of time without being caught. Some might say this is too convenient. Given we know how efficient the Fort Police are, this point does seem convincing. Just given the odds alone, could Julia really have eluded detection for that long? Even assuming she's only had 4 or 5 sexual partners, including Winston, given denunciations and tortures are fairly common, surely some connection would have arisen at some point in all that time. I can assume any amount of sexual partners, given I presume Julia is referring to the sexual act itself when Winston asks if she's done this before. She may very well have had sex many times or scores of times as she claims, but if we reread the dialogue in Chapter 2 of Part 2, she never actually confirms how many individual men she has slept with. Winston asks if she's been with inner party members, and she answers she's only been with outer party members, but doesn't give a number. The number then could be as low as 2 or 3, including Winston, or as high as double digits or more. The point here is that the higher the number of partners over that long stretch of time then, the higher the probability she would have been caught. This means A. She has had a few partners, all of whom have not been caught, have died or have committed suicide without giving her up. B. She's had many different partners, again all of whom have avoided denouncing her. Or C. She has had many partners, but given she works for the Fort Police, she is obviously immune from arrest. A seems plausible enough, that is, not too incredible. B is unlikely and also seems disconnected from Julia's own strategic mind, her careful planning of her meetings, and her strong knack for survival. Julia just doesn't strike me as that reckless. She wants to have fun, not to get vaporized if she can help it. C, of course, makes sense if B is also true and would explain her survival this long, given how effective the Fort Police are. I think all we can really say is that C is unlikely, given what we know eventually happens to Julia. Indeed, the end of the novel itself is clear on Julia's fate. Before we touch upon this, however, I would feel remiss if I didn't include another couple of points in favour of the spy theory. Another line later in the room also appears suspect. On seeing the picture, Julia comments that it probably has bugs behind it, though given she then says she'll give it a good clean sometime, it's obvious she's using the word in a biological sense, not in the sense of surveillance bugs. Of course, we know that there is indeed a telescreen behind the picture, and the line may be a clever bit of foreshadowing by Orwell, perhaps a sneaky clue for the eagle-eyed readers paying attention. However, this is probably simply a foreshadowing of the reveal of the telescreen itself later on, and not any indicator that Julia is a spy. A final, if limp, red flag for Julia's spy status could be her access to black market goods. Julia appears to have connections beyond any Winston has, having brought real inner-party chocolate to the meeting in the clearing, and later astonishes Winston by bringing real sugar, jam, white bread, tea and coffee to the meeting in the room. Though Julia nonchalantly answered black market when Winston asked how she got the chocolate at their first meeting, it could be explained as simply given to her by the inner party, that is, her Fort Police handlers. Interestingly though, later on in the room, Julia herself explains that such goods come from servants and waiters who steal things. We know inner party households are indeed staffed by servants, like O'Brien's man Martin. This explanation does strike me as sufficient. Winston himself buys razor blades and other goods in short supply. He also managed to procure a pen to write in his diary, which wasn't easy, and which shows there is a thriving black market of sorts. What I would suggest is that Julia is simply better at procuring such goods, and that the simplest explanation here is the best. A final series of nails in the coffin of the theory for me is in the end of Julia's story itself. We could of course argue that the assault on Julia after they were caught was all part of the act, but it does seem extreme. No one hit Winston after all. She could simply have been arrested and maintained her cover. She would have been no more suspicious than Winston himself was. That the Fort Police violently apprehended her does seem a strike to me against the spy theory. Everything we learned during Winston's interrogation could feasibly be lies on O'Brien's part to keep his agent undercover, though it's worth saying he told Winston that Julia too was interrogated and that she came over to the party quickly and was a textbook case. Though O'Brien refused to confirm it, it's also almost certain that she was tortured too. Finally, and most damning perhaps, is Julia's horrid state at the end of the book. She is physically and mentally transformed from who she had been. Winston recalls that she felt stiff as stone when he put his arm around her waist. She also had a long scar, partially concealed by her hair, across her forehead and temple. Furthermore, it's all but confirmed she went into room 101 and was forced to give up someone, very likely Winston, as she accurately describes something similar to Winston's own ordeal and having to put someone in her place. Given this, it seems very unlikely that Julia, based on what we know in the novel, was a spy herself. A final point could be that making her a spy, in addition to Charrington and O'Brien, may be stretching credulity too much. It also doesn't make much sense for Orwell to conceal it in this way. You would think too that there would be more concrete connections and indications than what we have too. Revealing or heavily indicating she was a spy would also reinforce the hopelessness of Winston's situation too, but such indications are just not there, or that obvious anyway. I think in the end, Julia was not a spy and was genuinely in love with Winston, or at least attracted to him as some believe. This serves to highlight the tragedy of Winston himself. Orwell gives our hero a small bit of happiness for a time, with a woman he loves or cares about briefly, only to have it torn away from him, and that love or connection forever severed by room 101. If Julia was simply another pawn of the Fort Police, this whole aspect of the story would be undermined. Of course, this is just my opinion. What do you think? Was Julia a spy? Write your thoughts and objections in the comments section, and drop the video a like if you enjoyed this content. Thanks for the view, and remember, Big Brother is watching you.